Hi guys, welcome back. This is the second part of the sentence basics presentation, and we're going to start talking about clauses. Clauses are extremely important when we're talking about understanding how sentences work and sentence structure. I would say 99% of knowing when to place a period or when to place a comma is understanding clauses and how clauses work. And so most of what we've talked about in the first 15 minutes of this presentation was to kind of help you to understand what goes in a clause and how they're structured. So we'll talk a bit about those. So what is a clause? A clause has both a subject and a predicate. So unlike a phrase, which is missing either the subject or a predicate, a clause has both. In other words, it has the ingredients needed to be a sentence. And clauses can be either independent or dependent. An independent clause is a part of a sentence that can stand on its own as a sentence. It says a subject, a verb, or a subject, a predicate, and a complete thought. A dependent clause may have a subject and a predicate, but it does not form a complete thought. Often this happens when we add a word to an independent clause, like she went to the store. That's an independent clause, but because she went to the store is not. It's a dependent clause. It needs an independent clause to provide more information. So independent clauses, as I said, they have a subject, a verb, and form a complete thought. They form a sentence. All sentences, for it to be a sentence, must have an independent clause. And they pass what's called the I know that test. And the I know that test, we'll talk more about it in a second, but it's a simple test that you can use to determine whether or not you have an independent clause or not. And that will tell you most of the time whether or not you need a comma or a period or what punctuation goes next. A dependent clause has a subject and a verb, but does not form a complete thought. There's a typo there. Oh, no, there's not, because this is dependent clauses, so that is grammatically correct. Dependent clauses must be connected in some way to an independent clause. And a lot of comma rules have to do with how we connect independent and independent clauses. A dependent clause will not pass the I know that test because it is not a complete thought. It does not have the subject and the predicate. So what is the I know that test? If you put the words I know that before any independent clause, it will make sense. If you put it before anything else, it won't. And there's a complicated grammatical, or not really that complicated grammatical reason for this. But what I want you to know right now is that this test is a lifesaver. I still use it when I'm not 100% sure. So, for example, I know that dogs like meat. Well, dogs like meat is a complete sentence, and the sentence, I know that dogs like meat, makes sense on its own. So it passes the I know that test, and we know that that is an independent clause, or it's something that could be a sentence on its own. But I know that because they're carnivores, that doesn't make sense on its, what's carnivores? Why is that important? I lost my words for a second. Because they're carnivores does not pass the I know that test. It cannot stand on its own. There are a couple of exceptions. Interrogative sentences and imperative sentences. So questions and commands will not, the I know that test doesn't work because the subject is either omitted or it's inverted. But with the exception of those two sentence types, everything else, this works. So now let's talk about sentence structures. And there are 4 structures for sentences. I don't want to go into too much information about this. It's helpful to know, but I also think it can confuse too. So the 4 are simple, compound, complex, and compound complex. And these structures are general rules, and they can tell you when you need a comma or what punctuation you need. So a simple sentence is one independent clause. For example, the dog ran. The dog ran to the store. In both of those, you have a subject, the dog. You have a predicate, ran. In the second one, it's a little bit more complicated because you have a prepositional phrase that says where the dog ran to, but it's still just one thought. And then, but don't be deceived. Simple sentences don't have to be short. This very long sentence is still a simple sentence because it only contains one thought, one subject, one predicate. The dog, who was wearing a green jacket and rain boots, ran to the store while it was sunny outside. You only have one subject, the dog, and you only have one predicate, ran to the store while it was sunny outside. That part in the middle is just additional information that tells you more about the dog, but it is still just a simple sentence. A compound sentence contains two independent clauses. For example, the dog ran to the store and the cat followed him. The dog ran to the store is an independent clause. You have your subject, the dog, you have ran to the store, which is your predicate. Then you have another one, the cat, subject, predicate is followed him. But they're combined into one sentence. So this is a compound sentence. And you can see that each of the individual parts of it will pass the I know that test. I know that the dog ran to the store, check mark. I know that the cat followed him, check mark. They're both independent. We'll talk more about this in another lecture, but when we have two independent clauses separated by a connecting word like and, we put a comma before the and to signal that it's a compound sentence, that there are two independent clauses there. A complex sentence contains one independent clause and one dependent clause. For example, when he realized it was no longer raining, the dog ran to the store. The dog ran to the store, as in the previous examples, is an independent clause. It has a subject, the dog, the predicate, ran to the store. But we also have another dependent clause here, when he realized it was no longer raining. When he realized it was no longer raining would not pass the I know that test. I know that when he realized it was no longer raining, you need something after that. And the thing you need after that is the independent clause. The dog ran to the store. It is a dependent clause, though, because it does have a subject, he, and it does have a predicate, realized. What makes this a dependent clause instead of an independent clause is the addition of the word when. If it was just he realized it was no longer raining, that would in fact be an independent clause. But when we add in a word like this, which is called a subordinating conjunction, it makes it dependent, and it makes it so that we have to have something, we have to have an independent clause after it. A lot of fragments, I'd probably say 75% of fragments, which are incomplete sentences, occur when someone puts a period right after raining here instead of a comma. They might realize that there's a subject and a verb here, but they don't realize it doesn't form a complete thought. And so they put the period there, but when he realized it was no longer raining is not a complete thought. It would not pass the I know that test. So we need a comma instead of a period there. Compound complex sentences, as you might be able to guess, are two or more independent clauses plus one or more dependent clause. So they are both a compound sentence and a complex sentence. For example, when he realized it was no longer raining, the cat ran to the store, or the dog ran to the store, and the cat followed him. Well, as we discussed earlier, the dog ran to the store and the cat followed him is a compound sentence. It contains two independent clauses, each of which could be sentences on their own. And as we talked about earlier, when he realized it was no longer raining is a dependent clause that's introducing these other ideas that cannot stand on its own. So we can put them together into one longer sentence that follows the rules of both independent and dependent clauses to make this compound complex sentence. Okay, so we have covered a lot of ground here. I intentionally tried to keep this set of lectures a little bit short. I know that it's dense. I know that it's a lot of information, and we kind of just went briefly over it. We will go over more on clauses and how they work, especially as the semester goes on. talk a lot about comma usage because quite a few of you have opportunities there, and that's really, really, really common. Sentence structure, things like periods of placement and commas are probably the most frequent sets of opportunities that we see in these classes, and we even see them in 101 and above. But what we've covered here, we've covered the four main types of sentences. So declarative, imperative, interrogative, and exclamatory. And remember, declarative ends in a period. It's a statement of fact. Imperative is a command, like take out the trash. We omit the you, but it's implied and it's still a sentence. An interrogative is a question, and we reverse the subject and the verb. An exclamatory is much like a declarative or an imperative sentence, but it ends in an exclamation point because it expresses intense emotions. We talked about subjects and predicates and the difference between a simple subject and a complete subject, and a simple predicate and a complete predicate. We talked about those sentence patterns. We talked about those very, 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 very briefly, but that was things like subject, intransitive verb, complement, or subject, transitive verb, direct object. The book, the McGraw-Hill Handbook, goes into a lot more detail about this. This is stuff we tend to cover more in advanced grammar more than in this level, so you don't really need to have that memorized, but it is helpful to know those terms to explain why certain types of sentences, especially when it comes to verbs, work the way they do. We also covered objects and complements. So we talked about what a complement is, what a direct object is, and what an indirect object is, and the verbs that go with those: transitive, intransitive, and helping verbs. We talked about phrases. Phrases are parts of a sentence that could not stand on their own. They do not have a subject or a predicate or both. We talked about clauses, independent and dependent clauses. We discussed how clauses must have a subject and a predicate. Independent clauses form a complete thought and form a simple sentence on its own. Dependent clauses often have a word added that makes it so that it must be connected to an independent clause because it does not form a complete thought. Independent clauses will pass the I know that test. Dependent clauses will not. And we talked about the four sentence structures: simple, compound, complex, and compound complex. So that brings us to the end of this presentation. If your head is swimming, that's okay. I just really wanted you to be familiar with the terminology. I forgot to change this slide though. You will be quizzed on it. You don't have to memorize it. The quiz is open book, open note. But yes, you will be quizzed on this. So it is important that you at least have a rudimentary understanding. If you're struggling with any of this, please let me know. Shoot me an email. I have lots of resources. I will be happy to talk with you more about it. If you don't want to contact me, that's cool too. You can go to tutor.com, you can go to a writing center, or you can go to ACE for tutoring. Those are all options for you. So that brings us to the end of this presentation, and I look forward to reading more of what you guys have wrote soon.